So the program tonight is the Free Press Under Fire, Navigating a World of Disinformation. We're going to start with under fire. Let's start hot. I think all of us know that this is a toxic time for the media. The president likes to attack the press. He calls you the enemy of the people. He finds pejorative names like MSDNC for certain news outlets. When he's kind, he calls you scum. So we know that that's kind of the level of toxicity that happens. I think we have this perception that this is new, that we've never encountered this kind of hostility from an American president until now. I looked back at one of our founding fathers, the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, who was decidedly pro-press. When he was a minister in France, he wrote the following: "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate a moment to choose the latter, newspapers without government." That was before he became president. During his presidency, he recognized that he was on the hot seat, and he wrote in some of his personal letters, "Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put in that polluted vehicle." Maybe his words were a little more eloquent, but I think they were equally as cutting. So I guess my question for all of you who are in the media is, how would you describe the attacks on the press now? What are the threats? What is the danger? What's the sort of state of the union with the press right now? Anybody can respond, whoever feels compelled to answer that.
I feel like Amanda should go first.
Oh, shoot. Well, today, if you've turned on the news, public media funding is up for debate because the rescission package that was submitted by the administration is gone through the House and received affirmative vote and now is being debated in the Senate. So it is prescient to predict the end of federal funding for public media, at least in the short term. What I will say to echo the theme here is that verbal attacks on the media are nothing new. Anyone who's under the scrutiny of the gaze of the press doesn't like it. They don't like to be covered, and I think that's a typical reaction. What I think is more troublesome are the structural attacks. I think that kicking certain outlets, picking and choosing who goes into cover and get access to information is potentially concerning. I think that attacks and baseless FCC investigations against media outlets without any initiating complaint is concerning and could potentially lead to the pulling of FCC licenses. So I think the weaponization of our institutions and structures to attack the press is more troublesome than words, certainly.
Others here.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, you can go back several presidents. Richard Nixon hated the press. Ronald Reagan didn't like the press. Anytime, you know, a politician or an elected official's ox is being gored, it can get pretty acerbic. So that's not really that unusual. I think Trump has been unusually effective in demonizing the media, unusually effective. And I think that has really affected our reputation. I'm concerned about ownership. You know, the ownership that we have, particularly in media, newspapers in particular, is different than anything I can remember. You know, before, rich families owned a newspaper, but that was the only thing they owned. You know, the Binghams, that's all they owned was the Louisville Courier-Journal. The Bancrofts basically just owned the Wall Street Journal. Sulzberger's just owned the New York Times. But now you have corporations that have varied interests that are way more valuable to them than a newspaper. Jeff Bezos, I mean, he's got a $100 billion enterprise, and he's, got $10 billion in contracts from the federal government. He paid $250 million for the Post. He's not going to let a $250 million thing jeopardize a $10 billion business, would you? And so the ownership is really, really, really different. He's been unusually aggressive in crippling the Post, but normally what these billionaire owners do is they just starve you of cash. They don't tell you what you can't cover. They just starve you of cash. They starve you of resources. They starve you of people. And so your ambition just becomes smaller and smaller and smaller until you really can't cover anything. But Bezos has been a little bit different. And, so I'm really concerned about that and the impact that that's had on the ability of, ABC, CBS, the Washington Post, a whole bunch of places to kind of do the job that they really should be doing for a country that's growing and becoming more and more diverse.
I think one of my biggest concerns right now really is social media and what it's done to the press and how it's changed how we do our jobs. And there's kind of a wonderfully startling documentary called The Social Dilemma that a Boulder filmmaker made. And he got a hold of some inside Facebook memos that basically said, the more divisive our content is, the more people spend time on our site, the longer they stay on our site, and the more they consume. And the memo warned that if we keep this up, it'll polarize the country beyond recognition. Yet they did nothing about it. And I think that's where we are, and it's really changed the dynamic of how people learn about news, consume news, and made it much more difficult for all of the operations we work for to kind of get through the noise, right? It's all mushed together. Opinion, blogs, Twitter comments, journalism, video, it's all in one big space now, and there's still a lot of journalism out there. What was the X-Files statement? The truth is out there. It still is. Represented by people, everybody on this stage. It's just harder to find it, go out and find it, I think.
I'll just say, despite what journalism has done to me physically, I'm not that old. And so 2017 was when, I think, were you still at the Post, Greg? I got assigned to cover politics, and so I haven't really known anything other than the current political climate. And one thing that is always kind of heartening to me is despite, the rhetoric out there and the attacks on the free press, I've been to, half a dozen Trump rallies at least. No one ever says no to talking to me, Even the people who are wearing all of the MAGA gear and they'll do an interview with me and then Trump will say something and everyone will boo the press pen, but they're still willing to talk to us. And even today was another good example of a reminder of how, it's sometimes difficult to separate, or you should separate kind of the high-level stuff from what's happening on the ground. One of the most conservative lawmakers in the legislature called me to give me a story. This is someone who was called for Kyle Clark to be arrested, right? And they still rely on the press, and it kind of gets back to the Thomas Jefferson idea that you were leaning at. Everybody hates us until they don't, right? I think as long as you're not, as a reporter, someone who's not in kind of a managerial position, as long as you don't take that to, personally, as long as you can see past that and still do your job, I think you can still get those viewpoints. There are plenty of people out there that still trust us.
Yeah, and I kind of think that is the beauty in what we do as journalists, is that we're able to be exposed to people from all walks of life and from all viewpoints. And I kind of think if we take the lens of what we do and apply that to everyday life, kind of take what we've learned. Maybe as a society, we may not be as polarized. That's just highly idealist of me a little bit, but I think that is the benefit, and it's part of our job to kind of bring you into those people's worlds as well, to show you, the people that maybe think differently than you, no matter what end of the political spectrum you're on.
Since we're on this topic, I think to expand on it a little bit more, it seemed like there was a time when we all, as a society, believed that the role of the press was to hold people in power accountable, and that that was an agreed upon kind of common value that we shared as a society. But I wonder, is that even true anymore? Does society really believe that's your job, since it really depends on who it is that you're reporting on, who you get attacked by? So comment a little bit on that role that was built into the First Amendment that now seems to be at risk.
I'll say yes. I think that's, our primary responsibility is we inform and we hold those in power accountable. And I do think at the end of the day, people want that. We have an obligation to our viewers and our readers to hold those, especially in elected office, accountable. I think you're going to have people that have a perception, though, based on their opinions, that maybe you're going too hard after this guy versus this guy. I've even had people where I've had maybe an interview that, things were tough, and I've had them say, you know what, you were fair. And that's when I know that I've done my job. But people are always gonna say, depending on their own personal bias, that you're too tough on this person versus this person. I usually know I'm doing it right when I get emails from both sides telling me that, this was not kind of you to ask this question or not. But at the end of the day, we have an obligation for our viewers, and you guys should expect us to ask the tough questions of our elected officials. And that's our primary responsibility. And I like to think that our audiences want that and expect it.
I think
One thing, just before you comment here, or Jesse, KOAA has one investigative reporter. That's her. That just gives you the sort of lay of the land in terms of some of the economics, maybe. Or maybe there's something else going on. Jesse.
I was just going to say, I think sometimes people look at journalists as these bloodthirsty, we want to take down people. And that's not why I got into this, right? I can tell you that it is really hard to have some of those, tough conversations with people when, if they've done something wrong or something's happened in their personal life, and you have to call them up and say hey, did you do this kind of thing? And it is part of our job, though, and I do appreciate the folks who understand that, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes, you kind of agree to get hated or whatever, but it's important, I hope people realize that, we're just trying to shed light on things, and the service that we do is for everybody. We're not doing it, for awards or fame or whatever.
Yeah, I would just say, I think that's the primary responsibility of the news organizations and journalists, is to hold elected officials empowered to account. And if we just did that, I think we'd be fine. But I think the problem is when you start calling balls and strikes and winners and losers, that you get in trouble. And as Vince was saying, there's this cauldron where everything is just kind of mixed up now, where you got opinion and columnists and commentators and pundits and all this stuff are all together, and it's hard to separate it, and it will make you angry, right? But I do think that the public expects us to hold power to account, especially when it comes to telling them things that they don't know. People in Flint, Michigan probably didn't like the Flint Journal until they found out that their water had been poisoned by their public officials, right? So that's what they need us to do. And I think if we can kind of separate some of the other noise, I think we could do a lot on our own to help repair our reputation.
Yeah, I would totally echo that. When we launched the Denver Gazette about 4 years ago, we did some readership surveys, and we asked people what they wanted more than anything. And it was really interesting. 93% of the people said they wanted unbiased news, balanced, fair news, that they felt like they couldn't get that. And 89%, they said they wanted somebody to keep an eye on the government. So I think Allison's right. People want this still, and people still know that there's a value to that. There was one study done recently that showed the cost of government went up in news deserts, right? And that fewer people were engaged in their sort of the civic life of their communities. We just did a story recently about, and I can't remember the town now, out in the Eastern Plains that lost its newspaper about a year ago. And now nobody's running for mayor. They don't have a mayor. And nobody really knows what's going on in the town. And I think there's a direct impact to how well the government runs when there's not anybody shining a light on it.
I'll also just say that accountability for our industry needs to start from the inside out. And when we regularly read about what sometimes happens within our industry, some of the injustices that happen, some of the conflicts of interest that go unchecked, there's plenty of things for us to turn the light internally on and address, because that does come across to our communities, our audiences. They want to know how we're holding ourselves accountable. And when we're not, it does erode our trust, erodes people's trust in our ability to look at others and say, hey, you need to clean up your yard. Meanwhile, my yard's not up for discussion. And so there's a lot of work we need to do inside our walls before we can fully confidently say to our communities, we are the right people to hold people, outside folks accountable for their injustices as well.
I want to have you think a little bit about the bias question, because I'd like to go a little deeper on that. But I do want to, some of you filled out the survey that we put up on the screen while you were sitting here about where you get your news. And this group here was kind of curious to see what the answers were going to be. So let me tell you of the people that responded, what the numbers were. So we asked the question, how do you primarily consume the news? The largest number of people do that online, on a news website, followed by TV and cable. And then behind that was, let me make sure I'm doing the color here right, social media. And then behind that was newspapers. Sorry, guys.
Could also be
Only 15% of our people here were reading the newspapers. Maybe they're doing it online, though. 9% radio, and then just a small sliver were doing podcasts. Then we asked you we gave you options of which news outlets are your primary sources. This isn't hold true nationally, but for this crowd tonight, the largest source of news for this audience tonight is NPR CPR. Now, you were given 3 options, so you got to vote for 3, so it's possible, you were stacking the deck a little bit on that. But second, it's pretty close. The Gazette was in with 30%, PBS 30%, MSNBC 30%, and then shortly just behind that was the national TV news and local TV news. The number 1 outlet for news in the nation, Fox News, was polling pretty poorly with this crowd here tonight. I'll tell you, it was... However, that's an interesting question for you all to address, because that is where a lot of people are getting their news. Then we asked the question, do you trust the media? Let's see. Absolutely, 15%. Mostly, 75%. Mostly not, and definitely not, came in with a combined 10%. I'll say that's not the way the national numbers play out. This crowd is a far more forgiving crowd on the media than the national crowd is. And then finally, this was a question we wanted to ask, do you intentionally look for perspectives that don't align with your own beliefs? 27% said often, 60% said sometimes, 12% said rarely, and nobody in this crowd said never. Again, I'm feeling like that might be a little bit different than the national audience. So, bias. Do you deserve some of the way that you're being perceived? Are you biased? Why is it that people think you're biased?
What you gave us, thank you very much.
Answer the questions about bias a little deeper now.
I'll jump in first, especially working in local TV. I think the question that I get a lot is, oh, well, I mean, you're owned by NBC because, you know, we've got the peacock logo on our building. It's on a lot of our station branding because we're an NBC affiliate station, but we're not owned by NBC. We're owned by a company called Scripps Media, which at its core has been a journalism company forever, like over a century. And most of your local affiliates, I think with the exception, CBS in Denver is owned by CBS or Paramount. It's an O&O, owned and operated station. But most of the local media stations, and in Colorado Springs, are all owned by these other companies that are not related to the network. And so that is something that I think a lot of people just don't understand. And it makes sense. It's a logical assumption to make. I made it myself growing up because why would you think otherwise? You see Good Morning America on ABC, and then your local news, comes on later in the day, and yeah, you would logically make that assumption. When it comes to bias in coverage, though, I will say I think in local newsrooms, people would be surprised to know there's a lot of thoughtfulness that goes into coverage. And at the end of the day, I mean, I've never ever had an editor tell me like, oh, make sure that you're really playing to the Republicans today or that you're really playing to the Democrats today. No, it's be fair and get both sides. That being said, though, I think there's fair criticism to be made. Do we mess up sometimes? Absolutely, we're human. It's gonna happen. And it's important for us to have that open dialogue with our viewers and our readers when we fall short, and also to admit when we're wrong and make amends on it. One thing, I'll give Colorado Sun a shout out. One thing that I love that you guys do on your articles is you have kind of this like truth test or whatever, and you show like original reporting, original sourcing, things like, I love that. And I'm like, I want to copy it so badly because I think it shows the process that you guys go through in your reporting. And I think that's so key for our audiences to understand that it's, we're often not just regurgitating. And if it's an AP article, it says so. It'll let you know. But for the most part, I mean, we pride ourselves on the enterprise reporting that we do.
Yeah, I mean, people are biased. We all have our own experiences. We have our own backgrounds that influence how we show up in the world, how we view the world, how we frame it up. But this is why journalism is a profession and not a hobby, because we work together to build in really intentional checks and balances so that we are recognizing both the benefit of having an authentic human experience shine through in how we're covering issues, but also the necessity to work together to be more transparent, to make sure we're managing conflicts of interest where you deserve to know the context of a story and the framing. And what you were referring to is something called the Trust Project. So there's this national organization that created a framework that the Sun uses, Rocky Mountain Public Media uses, Colorado Public Radio uses. We were all trained on this. And
Denver Post uses it as well.
Oh, good. Yes, you should talk more about it.
Oh, I mean, the Sun uses it, but the Post didn't use it when I was there. But I mean, I think like what you're getting at, right, is that sometimes I think people just don't understand how stories come together, and the more that we can bring folks into the process, the better. But personally, like I'm a political reporter, so I get accused of bias all the time, and I love when people send me emails telling me how I feel about something. I'm like, thanks, I didn't know I felt that way. So I appreciate that. I mean, I really come at every, look, I think no one has a monopoly on good ideas. I try and come at every story with an open mind. like Allison said, my editors aren't sitting there in the morning telling me like, go attack the Democrats today, go attack the Republicans, go attack this, wing of the party. Obviously people are biased, but I think that if, as a reporter, if you're searching for the truth and you kind of cut out everything else, then, you're going to get to the story and you're going to be fair. I think that there are plenty of examples of people in our industry like not doing ourselves any favors by being biased and having an agenda and not disclosing that. I mean, if you want to be a partisan reporter, if you have an agenda, be very clear about it. I think that there are some news outlets that try and act like they don't have an agenda, and they clearly do. And that is problematic for all of us. We talked about this kind of before, but I think opinion's a real issue. If I had my way, I would probably do away with all opinion journalism and the opinion sections, because I think it confuses the hell out of readers, and they conflate my work with others. But I think like doing events like this are really important. For the people who don't trust reporters, like I'm your neighbor. Like I don't know how I feel about anything. I'm just trying to get some answers to basic questions. And I definitely don't go into a story maliciously trying to attack people. And some people just will never believe that, but that's just the truth. I really don't have an agenda. My allegiance is to my wife and my dog. That's it.
Let me make a point about bias that I find myself explaining a lot. So at the Gazette specifically, there is a church and state divide between our opinion pages and our news pages. And our opinion pages lean conservative, but they also run a variety of voices. It's not just conservative. There is an interest in our company in having that exchange of views. We run John Caldera, but we run some Washington Post writers as well. We're very liberal. But I don't even let my reporters talk to the editorial page. It really is church and state. And we have a process that these guys have kind of talked about that's rigorous. And I think that's really what still sets journalism apart from media. We have editors, and those editors spend a lot of time trying to get balancing voices, both sides, plug holes. I've spent a month on a story recently trying to get more voices that won't talk to us from certain government, officials. But we keep working on it, I spend a lot of time saying, no, go back and do more reporting. A lot of my editors do that. We are constantly looking for more voices to add to the richness of the story and tell different sides. Usually, it's not two sides. Usually, it's like 5 sides. There's many sides to tell, and many voices to try to get into our stories. And then, often on a very touchy story, I'll run it by a lawyer to make sure we're not libeling anybody, or we're not, getting ourselves in a situation like CBS was in or ABC were just in. So there's a process that I just want to emphasize for everybody who's up here, where we're trying to vet information. That is so different than somebody just posting something on Twitter, right? That's really important to us at the Gazette and to journalists, people who call themselves journalists.
I think something, too, that readers don't recognize, and I think probably everyone on here would agree with this, but there's, no one more critical of our work than ourselves. There is no bigger critic of the Colorado Sun than me, and you can, Greg has heard me, complain about things. My editors, I call them all the time. If there's a story where I think a colleague didn't do as well as they could have, or I see an issue, I'll raise my hand and fight for it, until the bitter end. We want to be accurate. We want to be right. We want to be fair.
And journalists, that I know, I don't know most of my journalists' political affiliations. I don't ask that. But most of the journalists I know, they don't care that much about ideology. They care more about finding something new. They are driven by curiosity to be in this business. They don't want to be walking points of view. That's not what really got them into the business, or that even interest them. And, that's just something to keep in mind.
Greg, would you want to chime in on this? You were the first black at the Boston Globe. What was your title there again?
Managing editor.
Managing editor. And then you were the first editor of a large national newspaper at the Denver Post. There was a time when we embraced the idea that bringing in more diverse voices was positive. And it feels like that's being rolled back. Like all right, we checked that box, now let's go back to the way things were. Address the bias question when we can't even agree on whether it's good or bad to have diverse representation at all levels of the media.
I don't think there's any disagreement about that. I really don't. I mean, I've worked with a lot of different kind of people, and the combustion that takes place in a newsroom when you have people from different backgrounds is unbelievable. It just makes for a better product. I can't imagine anybody not thinking that that's a good thing. The problem is hiring practices in media outlets where seniority rules the day, right? So every time you have a downturn, the first people to go are those diverse folks that you have brought in. They're more recent hires. And because of the structural changes that are happening in media, they're making different choices now in college. You know, they're going to get an MBA, they're going to get a law degree, they're going to into the sciences. They're not willing to ride the roller coaster of media, being hired someplace and laid off in a year or two. So that's the real problem. And it's structural. Like, you really see it with the digital verticals. You go and you look at who's on that staff and you go, wow, there's not a person of color anywhere to be found. And that's something that I just keep harping on, that we have to redouble our efforts to do it, because it's not so much an issue of bias, it's an issue of omission, where issues that just don't get covered because the people who are in charge don't know any people of color in Park Hill, or they don't pay attention to what's happening to women when it comes to venture capital funding. There's nobody at the table to raise that issue. And people mistake that for bias, right? And it's really just a lack of sources and familiarity, because you don't have the right people around the table making decisions about what gets covered.
I'll just build on that as well to say that if you have enough drinks with journalists, some of the stories that folks will tell of the experiences they've had in their own newsrooms with just failures of leadership, is what I'll describe it. Yalmishan Alcindor, who was the former host of Washington Week, who's gone on to amazing things, and you'll see, I think she's at NBC, you'll see her regularly on the Sunday morning shows. She described being told by an editor that she could not cover protests of a man who was murdered by a police officer because he was black and she is black. That's an issue of bias. These are how distorted some of these conversations have gotten inside our industry, to the extent that we are losing the thread. We are missing the point altogether. Many, many, many people do not look at their daily newspaper or listen to their daily public media organization, whether it's radio or television, because they have never seen a version of their community reflected back at them that they recognize. And so there's some serious issues, and this is what I'm speaking about when I say accountability has to start within. We can't take the bait around these red herring conversations about bias or DEI and oversimplify them without turning the lens on ourselves, because we have allowed our industry to get distorted by politicians wanting to talk about these issues in a way that are dog whistles intended to strategically divide us or misdirect us from what's really important. And we have just had failures of leadership inside our industry that have contributed to real structural issues of garnering trust in the communities that we're here to serve.
So I've been getting a lot of questions here, and here's what I'm going to do. For me to be able to look at my text where all these questions are, I realize I'm asking questions of professional questioners. This is like, a wiffle ball player like me trying to get on to the LA Dodgers or something. So I'd like for each of you to kind of ask questions of one another for a couple minutes here while I look at the questions that our audience has sent in, and then I'll pose a question for each of you. So I open it up now to the professionals to have a conversation.
Okay, Amanda, I have a question for you. You mentioned earlier about shining a light on our own internal practices, our own failures. What exactly are you talking about? Are you talking about instances of plagiarism, or what are you talking about? What are the internal things that are undermining credibility with our audiences?
Yeah, certainly there are issues of plagiarism, but I think we would, if we were to take a level-headed look at that, they are very few and far between. That's not the biggest issue. I would say that the biggest issue is that for a long time, newsrooms were homogenous. They were overwhelmingly white men who were seeing the world through a certain lens, but telling everybody that they weren't biased, and that there was a structural separation between a newsroom and its community that was described as a method of maintaining objectivity that actually seeded mistrust. It separated us and from our own identities and how we contribute them to our work, but also from our communities, where we actually are members of our community, not just observers of our communities. And so some of these philosophies got, I think, distorted over time to the extent that they built a big lie that we are all unbiased and that we all see the world objectively, even though the truth was this was a very specific set of people seeing the world through a specific set of experiences and failing to see much further beyond that in a way that was reflected in their work.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
I've seen our readers kind of respond to, hey, show us your work. Like, show us your documents. Post the documents you studied for this story or found for the story. Put the interviews up, unedited. And, we want to see how you put the sausage together. And often they want to know more about the people who are putting the journalism together. And it's funny, some of our best read stuff is when our journalists talk about their work and how they got it done. It's like, whoa, let's do more of that because people like that. And I think they like that because it's transparent and it makes more sense about, how we're coming to the conclusions we do in especially sensitive kinds of investigative pieces. That's when we do it most, because I think people really want to know, well, how do you know that? Or how do you know this public official was wrong about this? Is this just your opinion? And the more we can show our work, I think the better it is.
Yeah, I know, one of the things that kind of came out of the CBS settlement was they said that they're going to publish transcripts of the presidential interviews. I don't really have a problem with that, just because we've even put out full interviews at times that we've done, and sometimes I've seen other stations do it where they've maybe been accused of being one side or another, so then they're like, okay, here's the raw interviews of everything that we did for this story, so you can kind of make that judgment call. And so I don't know, is it necessary for every single story? No, and it's also not realistic. We just don't have that much time. I'm fortunate with investigative that my station does give me a little bit more, but the average TV story is a minute and 30 seconds. And it's and so that's a challenge in itself, is kind of getting the story short enough to a way that it has that context, but also is just short and quick. TV news is kind of its own beast in that way, but I'm lucky with investigative that I'm often given time that I can show my process. I like to say I show the receipts, as the kids say, because I think people do. They want to see the documents, and they want to know, oh, where did you find that? What did you ask for? And sometimes it's lucky. Sometimes you're just strategic about the records request you put in, and yeah. we kind of sidebarred. So because I have the mic, Jesse, I'm curious. Working at the Colorado Sun, which is primarily funded through readers, and I know you previously worked at the Post, what do you see as kind of the key differences in the media landscape of kind of these more viewer-funded, and Amanda, this is probably a question for you too, of just, you know, viewer-funded, reader-funded media outlets?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so I worked at the Post for 4 years, and folks probably know it's owned by a hedge fund, and you know, for all of the downsides to being owned by a hedge fund, I think I went through 5 rounds of layoffs and buyouts in my 4 years there. You know, they never told us what to write, and I really appreciated that. And the time, it became time for me to leave when that kind of started to change, when we started to write about them. But you know, it's been interesting, you know, being funded by readers because. You know, Greg was talking about this idea of like Jeff Bezos owning the paper, Phil Anschutz, and you can make the argument that the reporters or the editors are beholden to those people, but we're beholden to our readers, and sometimes our readers don't like what we write. And even if it's true and even if it's accurate, you know, I think like we've got 15,000 or so members who support us, and I think they do trend to be a little more liberal. Probably a lot more liberal and so, you know, as an equal opportunity reporter, you know, when I write a hard story about Democrats, I you know, there are readers who will unsubscribe, but like we can't be afraid of that. But I think it's an interesting, like, we're all owned by somebody, right? Like we all have a boss, and I think it is an interesting like thing that we have to keep in the back of our heads. I mean, I will say that we do get you know, foundation money as well. Like I don't even know who gives us money, thankfully, and so I can't even say that they influence our work. But it is an interesting, like, you know, debacle here, right? Like obviously, an advertiser would be the best thing. I mean, even those folks, I'm sure, get mad at sometimes, as you know, folks who have been in the industry a little longer than me can talk about. But I mean, I think Vince, the ownership question's got to go to you. I mean, I'm curious how you guys manage that, and if it influences the work that you do.
How my ownership influences the work?
Yeah, I mean, I was an intern at the Gazette. I can remember one time maybe where the publisher had some sway on a story, but I didn't have any interaction for sure with Phil Anschutz, but I don't know how it works now.
Yeah, and that came up several times with questions that I was getting. I think we do have people that are really invested in the Gazette and want to know that. And also just what is the basic financial model? Like how is the Gazette funded? How much power does the ownership group have on the newspaper?
Well, let me say one good thing about working for a billionaire, because now I've worked for 2 of them. I worked for Anschutz and I worked for Bezos in Washington. And the good thing is we don't have to worry about our daily existence or how we're going to survive in a very tough climate. And there's something to be said for that, because then we can focus on mission more than economics. And it depends on the owner and the model, but as Greg said, you know, rich people have owned newspapers for a long, long time, and families that are dedicated to them, it's not a bad model because they're less swayed by the political winds than maybe corporations or newspapers that are really, really vulnerable to economic downturns. So that's the good part. I rarely ever see our owner. I never really have conversations with him at all. He likes to check in and see how we're doing, but he has a lot bigger businesses than ours. And it's really kind of a stupid investment for him to invest in newspapers. So he does that because, and he said this to me, well, I want Colorado Springs to be a very vibrant, good town, and I think a good newspaper helps that. I want Denver to be a vibrant, good town, so the more journalism, the better. The more voices, the better. And I actually think Colorado and Denver especially are kind of lucky right now, because there's a lot of good journalism going on at the Post, at the Sun, at PBS. You know, there's a lot, and we challenge each other, right? Some of my most fun days were when I was at the Denver Post competing with the Rocky Mountain News, and every morning you'd look to see if you got your ass kicked or you won. And that was fun, and it was good for readers too, because we sold, you know, sold 1 million papers a day at the height of that battle, and some of them were for like a penny a copy. You know, readers benefited, right? The more light that is shined on the city, the better. So the downside of ownership is when the owner wants to influence coverage. Now, our owner very much sticks to the editorial page. So I'm lucky in that sense. And I think if there was any sort of beginning of trying to sway what I do, then I would leave. Because I just don't see that as a real good way to run a newspaper. So our owner does influence the editorial page, and that seems to be where he really wants to have his influence. His son sits on our editorial board, so there's a direct, you know, line of connection to our owner on the editorial page, and he's very serious about that. But he kind of gets the idea that the more the newspaper is independent of him and his investments and businesses, the better. Now, Bezos was an interesting counter to that a little bit, because when I was there, when he bought the paper, I was there when he bought the paper in Washington, and he bought it as more of a technological challenge. I think he thought, can I bring some sort of internet savvy, tech savvy to journalism and help save it? I think that was his driving influence. You know, many of us who were at the Post, alumni and even current, were very disappointed when there seemed to be a turn in Bezos's approach on Trump's second run. During his first administration, you know, it was a contentious relationship, but it was a healthy one. I remember once my editor, Marty Barron, was asked about the tension and Trump disparaging journalists and everything. It's like, well, he said, well, we're not at war, we're at work. This is what we do. We're going to hold them accountable. That's what we're going to do. We're not going to let anything change our basic approach. So now Bezos gave $1 million to Trump's inaugural committee. It's just, okay, like you said, Greg, clearly he has other businesses and those are important for him to protect. But I would argue, if you're going to buy a newspaper and you're going to buy a media outlet, that's still your most important business because it's a public trust. And if you start to hurt that public trust and the trust people have in it, then you're not doing what an owner should do. I couldn't believe when I saw him sitting at the inauguration in front of Trump's family. It was like, why are the tech bros in front of your family? And I think, he felt like he won that somehow. He won a battle there. I also think, you look at this recent CBS settlement, right? Where 60 Minutes edited an interview with Kamala Harris. And we do that every day, where we edit interviews because we don't have 1 million pages to put stories into, right? Or you have an hour of airtime at the most, probably a lot less than that in TV or radio. So you have to sort of edit things to fit, edit things down. We do that constantly. That's what 60 Minutes did. They also ended up putting the full interviews, the full transcripts up online. But they settled this lawsuit. That was very disappointing, and I think that could hurt us as an industry for $15 million. And I think the reason they settled it is this merger they wanted to do with Skydance. Very bad sign, and a lot of us journalists are angry at CBS right now.
Yeah. Greg, we got asked that question about the settlements with ABC and CBS, and I know you speak nationally to that topic. Anything you want to add to what Vince has said here?
I think part of what got CBS in trouble was presenting two different versions of that interview in an effort to boost two different broadcasts. And the question that would be very difficult to answer is, why did you do that?
Yeah.
That's a very difficult question to answer. And normally we don't have to answer that question because we don't share that. You know, and up until now, you wouldn't be able to compel us to share that, even in a court of law. And so I think that became the basis of the need to settle, right? Now, I still think they shouldn't have done it, but I will say this. I've been dealing with courts to get access to documents and stuff. When I left the Post in 2016, I can't tell you how many court cases I lost in 2010, 2012. Like, the judiciary was turning against journalists way before Trump. Okay, I mean, you just could not win in court. You could not get access to phone records. You could not get access to transcripts of meetings and things of that nature. So the ground had already shifted beneath our feet. We were losing more cases. In fact, we lost a case at the Post. We took it all the way up to the Court of Appeals, and then we had other journalism organizations begging us not to go to the state Supreme Court for fear that we would lose there and set a precedent that would hurt all journalists in Colorado. And so we didn't do it. So the ground has shifted on us, and it's just shifted more aggressively against a free press in the years since then. So I don't think CBS had a flush, a royal flush, okay? There was a really good chance they might lose that, I think.
Thanks for addressing that. Amanda, I wanted to touch on the daily issue that you spoke about today. There were a couple of people that asked the question about the danger that's represented by the cuts in funding to local news. And I know, as I've listened to PBS and NPR and CPR, the loss in funding they're framing as the rural areas, the smaller markets, are the ones who are going to lose out. Address that a little bit. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of public media is that we exist in communities across this country at a grassroots level with both infrastructure and literal boots on the ground in a way that you all and us together as taxpayers have built up over decades, over generations in some cases. And so our model, our business model, is membership-based first and foremost. We survive and thrive because people just like you are investing in our content, even though you can get it for free, because doing so, our research shows us, is a demonstration of what you perceive to be shared values. Now, that's really, really important and very, very different than why you might be subscribing to Netflix, for instance, or checking in at Facebook. And that difference is really vital, and it's going away everywhere. You know, these declarations and accountability to a shared set of American values is something that we need to keep at the forefront of our conversations to remind ourselves that there are still things that we believe in together that are worth fighting for, that are not about politics, that are not about partisanship, and that are not about any one organization or special interests. Like they are things that bind us as Americans, and that term is so much broader than I think we oftentimes are shortcutting in today's conversations. But all that being said, when federal funding goes away, there's a few reasons why you should be really, really concerned. Number one is the attack on public media is about more than just our industry overall. It is about wounding our access collectively to a shared set of facts and information, and it's about removing local journalism as a structural investment as taxpayers. And once that happens, it's very hard to recover from that, and it hurts everybody, no matter if you're CBS or you're the Gazette or your Rocky Mountain Public Media. We all are hurt by things like that. And I will say that public media is uniquely special because we are in places where there is no commercial incentive to be there. There is no commercial incentive for us to be in Fruita, where we have a facility, we have staff on the ground. Last year alone, we convened 100,000 Coloradans in person, not just in Denver, in the metropolitan area where most people live, but in places around our state. Amber Cote, our director of civic engagement, is here. She actually did this. Going around to cities, convening people, talking about how important it is to trust your local news source, even if it's not us. These are things that that there's just not a commercial incentive to do. And so that is what is lost when we talk about rural stations. Rural stations in some cases get 40 to 60% of their funding from the federal government, just as rural flights, you know, if you're flying out of DIA trying to get to Durango or trying to get to Grand Junction, really critical commercial thoroughfares to make it possible to live in those communities but still make a living. Those flights are subsidized by the federal government. That's why they exist. And so you won't hear a better argument for the importance of taxpayer investment, and you won't see a dollar getting stretched further than you will in a rural community that is taking a very, in the case of public media, it's a quarter to 50 cents a person, depending on what state you're in, and stretching it into $5 or $6 per person. So that's what gets damaged, and there is no big company that's going to come in and set up shop in Fruita or Rifle. There's no commercial incentive. There's no money to be made.
Thank you for addressing that, yeah. All right, for our two youngsters at the end, we had self-identified young audience members here that I'm going to pose questions to each of you. Jesse, someone asked, how can we have productive conversations when we're surrounded by this toxic social media environment that Vince was describing? What would you suggest?
Oh, gosh. I mean, as a young person who consumes social media a lot, you know, like I still rely. I don't listen to the things that people say on there. I mean, I'm obviously a little more educated about the media than probably most, but you know, I read, you know, the sources that I trust. I read the New York Times. I read the Wall Street Journal. I read, you know, CPR, and I look at, you know, the local stations. If something's going on in Colorado Springs, the first place I go to is the Gazette. So I think just finding trust in those places and investing in them is important, and it's hard. Like I have some great friends. We went to the best school in the world at Colorado College, so they all, you know, subscribe to the New York Times and the Colorado Sun and their local newspapers, and you know, getting to what Amanda was saying, like I was thinking about this, like kind of what we're asking people to do is to like to pay us money to tell them things that they don't want to hear, and like if you can understand why that's important, then you'll get it and you'll make that investment. And so, you know, I think as young people, right, I think you have to pony up that $5 a month or the, you know, $20 a month for the Times, and put down the social media and don't believe the things you read on there. But it's tough. You're inundated as a young person. You know, I have friends who believe everything they see on social media, even though that they can just come ask me about it, and it's frustrating. But there is some like personal responsibility involved here. You've got to make the investment in your community the same way that you know, journalists are trying to invest in you know, improving and access and knowledge and those things. So I'm not sure how you do that. I think, you know, being on the sites where folks are at, TikTok and Instagram, you know, reaching people where they're at is really important. The issue for us is that isn't commercially viable, and even though we're a nonprofit too, like we've got to run a business, and if anyone has any ideas, come find me after this.
So going a little further on that, Allison, you ahead of time indicated that you'd like to talk a little bit about how you as a television reporter are utilizing social media, and then integrate into that answer a little bit about AI. There were a number of questions about how is AI changing what all of you are doing?
Okay, so two-parter here. Well, one, I think social media is one of the worst things for our industry and one of the very best things for our industry. I say that the worst is that we're constantly, I think news consumers don't always necessarily understand weeding through the noise of those credible voices and who's a journalist versus who is an influencer, I guess is probably the best way to put it. I think social media can lend itself, and kind of, Vince, as you were alluding to, with the social dilemma of it rewards those polarizing voices. On the flip side, though, I think it does a lot of good because it makes us have a conversation with each other. And we can build that trust through actual conversations online, which sometimes, albeit not productive. It's a learning adventure for me of when to engage and when not to engage, because sometimes you got to pick your battles on that one. And so but I do think in terms of how I'm using social media, I've also figured out, there's a different way of telling stories for our traditional TV product versus how I tell stories online. And to be honest, it's a lot more casual. And it's kind of been a fun little experiment for me of kind of like, oh, can I try this form of storytelling for on air for our kind of linear product and have it translate to multiple different platforms? And, sometimes it lands, sometimes it doesn't. People are like, we'll get emails from, some of our longtime viewers are like, what the heck? Like, why is this reporter telling me about the difference between Space Force and Space Command? But then, online, people are like, oh, thank you for finally breaking this down for me in a more casual, laid-back manner. Now I'll get to the AI side of things, because I think this is actually an opportunity for us as an industry to do really well, because I feel AI has already caused a lot of confusion for people in the digital space, of people not necessarily understanding what's real, what's not. I think there's an opportunity as journalists for us to kind of emerge, because people will start to recognize I can go to outlets like Rocky Mountain PBS and Colorado Sun. I know what I'm getting. I know that they're a trusted news source versus this random XYZ Colorado news that just popped up, and it turns out it's not even a real news outlet, but it looks like one to me. And so I think AI it's going to make our jobs harder for a little bit, because I think it's going to lend itself to maybe a little more misinformation and disinformation. But I also like to think it's going to give us an opportunity to move forward, because people will be getting exhausted by how much is out there.
Thank you. We have about a little bit over 5 minutes before we wrap here, so I want to do 2 questions for the entire panel. First one's just a short answer. There were several people that wondered, what do each of you choose to be better informed or to address disinformation? What source, what process, just tell us your process for dealing with that.
Well, I try to triangulate so that I look every morning at a bunch of different sources on all sides of kind of the aisle, and really good sources. So, I'll look at the Wall Street Journal, I'll look at the New York Times, I'll look at Atlantic, which is really doing some great journalism these days. I'll look at the Denver Post. I always look at the Denver Post. I always look at the Sun every morning. I look at PBS every morning. I look at CPR every morning to see what they're doing and see, kind of how we stack up a little bit, but also, what they're interested in and what the news, how they are, playing the news and thinking about the news. And so I think that's a good process, to find people you trust in different news outlets and check in with different ones. So that's what I do.
And I do something very similar to that. I would probably add The Guardian to that news diet. But I'm real disciplined. Like, I don't forward anything unless I've read it. I don't forward anything unless I've seen it someplace else and confirmed it on my own. I mean, if the New York Times has an exclusive story, I'm going to trust that, or the Wall Street Journal. But if I find something I go, holy mackerel, I can't believe it, I just get my fingers off the keyboard. I just stop. I'm not gonna spread disinformation or misinformation. And then I'm gonna wait an hour and see if somebody else is reporting it. And if they're not, then I never go to that source again. I mean, like, you only get, I'm not like George Bush, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you too, whatever he said. I'm not like that. You get one chance. And if you're spreading false information, unverifiable facts, I don't go back to you. So.
My 9-year-old daughter helps me fact check where I've been punked. And so yesterday I was like, Simone Biles is pregnant. She's like, no, she's not. That's AI. So my 9-year-old daughter has media literacy that is almost God-given. I do listen and read compulsively. And so I am, like, if I'm not in a meeting, if I'm not talking to my family, I'm listening or reading something. And so I triangulate just as everyone else is describing. Lately, I will say that I'm particularly tuned into Punchbowl News, which has been a really interesting source for understanding parliamentary procedure and all the craziness in DC, as we're just trying to anticipate what might happen with public media. I do go to Drudge Report. I also go to social channels to see what's trending, so that I can understand outside of my box, like, what are people looking at, and what's being pushed up in the algorithm, things like that. I'm just intrigued by, even though it's not always quality, good information.
Yeah, I mean, I love the New York Times. I read it all night. I wake up in the middle of the night and read it. I love the Wall Street Journal. One of my favorite things I get to do every week in our unaffiliated newsletter is we do like a section that's kind of like informing the Colorado headlines. So I'll go around to news outlets across the country, and I'll find kind of themes that are happening in other places and how it's maybe playing out. Like, there's a lot of parallels between what's happening in this Washington State Legislature and Oregon State Legislature in Colorado, sometimes Texas, California. Like, it's great to kind of read that stuff. But I think, like, my best tool is just being skeptical. I mean, it's fine to be skeptical even of the New York Times. And, I think, like, if you read one of my stories and you get to the end of it and you feel like, well, I don't trust this, then I haven't done my job in showing my work. So please call me. I'm happy to share my work.
I'm a big newsletter consumer in the morning. It's kind of just part of my morning routine after I walk my dog. So there's a lot. There's New York Times, there's Washington Post, Axios is another one. I also read Politico. And then I go through, like, kind of all the locals. Oddly enough, I don't really consume morning news on TV as a TV reporter. Most of my, like, visual journalism consumption is done by individual stories online. So I mean, I love to see, like, what some of my favorite reporters in Denver and Colorado Springs are covering for the day. I read the Gazette as well. They're a great news partner of ours, and so I'm kind of all over the place in the morning, truthfully, is kind of how I start my day. And then throughout the day, you're just kind of, like, inundated. It just doesn't turn off, I feel like, when you're in this industry. You're too plugged in sometimes, but yeah. For mental health, sometimes I have to shut my phone off, though. But just give yourself a little break.
And that's how I want to end. So we've spent a long time tonight talking about ways to engage the news media, be more thoughtful media consumers, have better conversations with one another. Greg, I'm going to single you out to start with, and then the others can answer too. Greg, just in the last year or two, started a new nonprofit called Cloutify. As a news editor, you'd think he'd spelled the word right, but he didn't. It's Klowtify, Cloutify. And there was a blog that he wrote on November 22nd, 2024. There was an election just before that, I think. And it was entitled Trump to Here's What a Formal Journalist is Going to Do. And essentially you proposed, I'm just going to take a little break.
Yeah.
And I just want to sort of finish with each of you saying, when you decide, I've had enough, how do you reboot and recharge and take a break?
So I basically said I wasn't going to do in 2024 what I did in 2016, just watching Twitter and watching CNN and falling asleep with my phone in my hand. And then I thought better of it. I was like, that's not really right. Like, I really need to be on my game here, right? And so I took only a month off, and now I'm fully re-engaged, and I hate that I actually wrote that.
I'd like everyone to answer this. So whoever would like to ask, and you look like you're ready to go.
I mean, yeah, I think like your body just kind of tells you sometimes, and your brain does. And I don't know, like it's hard because I mean, generally, like you get into this business because you enjoy news and you enjoy consuming, you enjoy finding that story that no one else has, and so it's a lifestyle, really. But I think it's not necessarily a sign of weakness to recognize if it's like, okay, like it's not always healthy to be plugged in 100% of the time. I mean, I'm very big of, I'm like, when I'm at dinner with my husband, like phone is like on ringer, but like it's not at the table. And so I think there's little things you can do to kind of have a healthier relationship with your technology and your news consumption. That being said, I'm not big on like, don't avoid it completely. You need to be informed, but I think you recognize when it's hurting more so than helping.
I read the New York Times to relax, so maybe that's. I mean, I would encourage people to not. I mean, maybe this is a bad advice, but I would really encourage people not to. Like to resist the urge to turn it off, right? Because once you do that, then you're not informed, and then you're missing things, and then you're kind of letting people do what they want to, which is probably not a good idea. So, yeah, I mean, I think I just if I'm not working, I'm usually reading, and if I'm not reading, I'm usually watching, YouTube documentaries. So that's my happy place.
Man, I feel embarrassed at what I'm going to say next.
And while we get the last two answers, I'm giving you your last call in case you're formulating that haiku. No pressure, no pressure. Amanda.
I listen to a bunch of trash. Like we were talking backstage, I've been listening to like horror books and thriller books. I've listened to 30 since the election, 30 books. I never ever read that much. I mean, actual books. I'm usually an article person.
Vince, how about you?
When I realized that I've been staring at a screen like for 16 hours, I realized that I got to go out into the big blue room outside and actually talk to some people face to face. And I think we forget that a little bit. It's a whole different experience, meeting people face to face, getting together with some people that I cover. I just went out and hung out with the superintendent of the Air Force Academy because I just wanted to meet him. And I had a blast for 3.5 hours. And, it's just the real people thing is refreshing and rejuvenating. Seeing you guys here is rejuvenating because it's like, connecting with people, seeing the nuances in their faces, their reactions, rather than the sort of flattened screen of a person who you can't really read. It just makes all the difference in the world.
So Greg, I know you disowned the blog that you wrote in November, but I do want to read one paragraph that I think it lasts. I do intend to devote time talking to fellow Americans, especially my neighbors and friends, to better understand who they are, what they think and worry about, why they voted how they did. I'm especially interested in learning more about Trump voters. No judgment, just discovery. I think that'll preach. Jesse?
I haven't checked the syllables, but subscribe to The Sun, watch KOAA and PBS. Gazette is good too.
All right. He delivers. Nice job, Jesse. I want to make sure we put up on the screen our QR code for folks who want. There we go. That's the one we want up there. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to all of you for giving up a Tuesday night to be a part of this conversation. If you'd like to see more programming like this, go to our website, learn about what we're doing, support what the Greenberg Center is doing. And then one more big hand for this amazing panelist tonight.